welcome to No Royal Road, where we actually talk about Chris Wickham, that we said we were going to do last time.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
We'll see if we get there.
It is on the plan, but like the plan towards socialism, it is often delayed, stalled, and who even knew what it was?
Listen, the course inexorably leads to the discussion, but we don't know how many twists that road will take.
Yes. The arc of history tends towards the discussion. Maybe. But also, never rule out the common ruin of the contending podcasters.
So, we're going to start with an article which is kind of a condensation of a book. This is kind of a condensation of another book.
Yes. Triple distilled. Chris Wickham.
Yeah, so this is the other transition from the ancient world to feudalism, and then we're going to be making reference to the feudal revolution debates, which will bring up the debates between Chris Wickham and other Marxist academics, Samir Amin, the late Samir Amin, who I do quite like in a lot of ways, but who I think Wickham kind of makes a hay of some categories that Amin wants to bring up. And then we'll also kind of mention historical transitions, a comparative approach, but that was the article that got us on a tangent for 2 hours last time. So we're going to try to focus on the other transition. So let us begin. How the hell did Rome become medieval Europe, and why does it matter? Go.
It did a lot of things none of which make sense if you put them all together. And I guess it matters because we are experiencing a transition, maybe?
We're trying to understand transitions. That's why it matters.
Right.
And we're really bad at it. I mean, as the left, at understanding transitions. And this is an attempt to try to understand them a little bit better. But as far as how did the Empire of Rome, the classical mode of production, the great state apparatus devolve into medieval feudalism, quote unquote, devolve, right?
Yeah. Which
how did that happen?
I think Wickham convinces me that it's actually not a devolution at all.
Right. Yeah.
One, two. I think it's interesting because I've been attracted to these debates before I even knew. Well, I should say before I even knew Wickham. I actually had Wickham's book before I realized he was a Marxist, but I was trying to figure out the answer to these debates on myself because I started having this crisis of faith about the emergence of capitalism. Because I find elements of capitalism going back, if you read someone like Brundell or the longue durée theorist, you start seeing evidence of proto-capitalist relations, even from the Marxist definition, as early as 1100.
Oh yeah, if you look at the northern Italian states, it's
right,
emerging there, it very much looks like capitalism,
right?
Even down to the bourgeoisification of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the Brenner and Wood, area of debate is already much, much broader than classical Marxism sort of bequeathed to us, and it does seem a little bit too narrowly hemmed in, I guess, if you spend enough time on this. What we're talking about, right? This other transition.
Right.
You start to see elements of contemporary society going back to not the last society or the last model, right? But the one before that, surviving all the way through two transitions.
Right. So, what causes the bourgeoisification of the Italian city-states, which is never completed?
It's I would say it's circumvented.
Right. So the debates in the Brenner debate, which I tend to side with the Brennerist on, actually, but the debates are interesting because basically what you're arguing over is capitalism's emergence a requirement of what we would call full capitalism, which we really only see in its developed form, transitioning from agrarian labor and enclosures and all that, in England first. All right. And it's a bunch of, and it's not, and people think this is some kind of Eurocentrism or even English centrism. And Brenner, it's a historical accident of why this happens the way it happens. Whereas, and this is interesting for this debate, if you side with Jaureus Banerjee, that's a name, by the way, that I've probably said 1,000 different ways because I've never actually heard it pronounced correctly. But I'm going to say Jairus Banerjee, Jarius Ban or Ban.
BA.
Yeah, Baneji. Or
BANAJI.
Baneji. Okay, yeah. Which this is the debate of theory as history. If you say that you can call something as resembling the mode its origin instead of having weird transitional modes, he has this idea that like we can talk about capital because most of the elements exist going all the way back. And it's a debate he's having with like super orthodox Maoist in India in the 70s. What's interesting implications of that, though, is if you take him super seriously, you can actually trace capital as a form going all the way back to the end of Rome, which is why this debate matters to the second debate. So if you don't think this matters, then you do end up with something like transhistorical capital, because elements of capitalism exist at the end of Rome. No, and not only then, elements of capital exist at the end of the first Islamic Caliphate in the Islamicate world. Elements of capitalism exist during a couple of the Chinese empires, including up to like paper money and stuff. Like,
yeah.
So what is Wickham's take here?
Well, like a very quick stab is, I guess it's, I think it's a general point that can sort of retroactively apply to the capitalism discussion as well, which is that the transition is long and messy, and it's completed only when an identifiable mode of production like prevails. Not even necessarily is completely like that it's the only one. Right? I think he says something that I think is really, really illustrative of, I guess, the way to think about this, which is that we should not think of a system as made up of exclusively complementary components, right? But that like this, whatever you want to call the late Roman Imperium, and at whatever point you want to decide that feudalism has been, fully prevails in terms of the social relations, that it only does so by being held together or interacting with other elements which are run counter to its logic. Right. That like they don't have to be harmonious. So like the existence of both slavery in the classical mode, in the classical sense of what slavery means, and feudal relations in the land existing side by side, that doesn't mean that they actually benefit each other or reinforce each other. They're actually constantly in tension and driving toward, right? It's, to put it simply, you have to have a dialectical read of how these things develop.
That, and he talks about the existence of the late Roman state being predicated upon a previously dominant mode of production, yet it's still extracting wealth in the form of taxes, as though, it's still extracting wealth in that old manner through the cities, and that tax extraction actually breaking down is part of what leads to the Western Empire's collapse.
Right. Which is actually not even unstandard as I know, for example, like standard liberals who will talk about this as part of the Western Empire's collapse is the breakdown of the tax systems, the taxation systems, plus the weakening of the currency through the introduction of other metals, which I know sends my MMT friends up the wall. But let's talk about why that's important. The importance of the currency is not for trade within the Roman Empire. The metallic base is not what's relevant. The reason why the metallic base is relevant for currency is for trade for things outside of the Roman Empire when it is no longer expanding, which it definitely isn't at the 3rd century.
No.
So
it's contracting.
Right. So if you have a weakened metal base, and so this is something to like throw against the like standard liberal interpretation of this. The reason why the weakened metal base is important is not because it's made the money less valuable within the Roman Empire, but it's made it unreliable as a means for trade outside of it.
Right.
And so this really matters when you mix that plus tax farming in the urban areas based on this like urban rule, with the assumption that a whole lot of the population are slaves too, and that's part of the tax base. What you start having is the collection of slaves, servants, and other people on these manorial estates. And these estates are a way to avoid paying taxes to the central government, particularly in the West. So who knew that tax policy was important even in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century? But it really ends up mattering. What I think is also interesting is Roman society, as opposed to Greek society, was really into the manumission of slaves. So when I say really into, like slavery was generally not something that you state. Well, I don't know if I could generalize it, but there was a lot more people who worked their way out of slavery or were given freedom or able to buy their own freedom.
Yeah,
and
slaves were paid a wage.
Right.
And they could do whatever they wanted with that wage. One of the things they could do is buy themselves out of slavery.
Right. So Roman slavery is different than modern early modern chattel slavery, or even from Greek slavery, which was also very hard to get out of.
Right.
So there's actually a declining amount of slaves in the Roman Empire as it quits expanding because people are freeing themselves, but they're not doing conquest to expand massive amounts of new slaves. This is part of what causes the barbarian tensions to come up. I mean, there's one of many reasons, but so you have kind of a storm of conditions with tax policy, with immigration patterns, with climate change. Mm-hmm. There's just 1,000 things happening at once. And Wickham wants to point out that, like, if you understand this in ancient terms, the cultural or state distinctions, ancient terms, if you understand this in economic terms, that the cultural and state distinctions and stuff are part of that. They are not what's driving it. So the whole debate, is it barbarians or is it Christianity? Well, Wickham's going to say, well, no, barbarians and Christianity are tied to these other issues.
Right. Those are symptoms that are growing out of those situations.
Right. But then Wickham's also going to point out that, like, the assumption, I mean, and I had kind of gone on this before really dealing with Wickham. So I was always like, well, you know what? We always talk about how the Dark Ages are so dark, but, like, there's more text about the Dark Ages in the 8th century. I have more literary relevance surviving to the modern day about the 8th century than I do about the 3rd. So, like, how is it so dark? Well, it's that there's fragmenting languages and cultural histories, and a lot of the stuff that you read is couched in religious language, and epic language, and we think of that as like a decline state. But they have enough wealth, even with the breakdown of the Roman system, to produce this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, You've got a church institution that is employing literate scribes to do nothing except for record things and to store them away.
Right.
So, yeah.
Dark Ages, upon reflection, is more of a kind of a ideologically tinged kind of political characterization rather than anything objective. Like, if you lament the demise of the Roman Empire because you see it as embodying a lot of potential that it doesn't fulfill, then it's fragmentation, it's breakup, right? And like what we talked about last time with the breakup of the old trade networks in favor of new ones, that's, it's a geopolitical catastrophe for a certain type of person, akin to like the breakup of the Soviet Union. But it's not actually the case that there is there's more of a decline from the breakup of the Soviet Union in some ways than there is from the breakup of Rome, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say, like, the barbarian kingdoms, they laid hand on the machinery of the state and just replaced the ruling class, right?
Yeah, or absorb. I mean, absorb
the ruling class.
I mean, it's kind of like saying, to think about it in modern terms, we didn't get rid of the late feudal ruling class in Europe. Well, in England, we never got rid of it, but most of it's not truly absorbed into the bourgeoisie until after World War II. Yeah. Right? Like, right.
Well, that's why you have all of in the Marxism in its classical period always talking about needing to finish the bourgeois revolution, right? There's all the old aristocracy still exists, even though they exist, in perfect harmony with the capitalist system. Right.
But what it's funny is how that gets translated now. So that becomes an abstract where originally it was a concrete. So the way Marxists who want to hold on to that language talk about it. now is like, well, we have to fulfill the ideological promises or the rights promises or whatever, which are only enabled through communism. My friend Doug Lane is very much one of these people. Whereas I'm like, no, they're talking about the fact that the feudal aristocracy still exists. Yeah. Like, literally still exists.
Yeah, like there is still a House of Lords, you know?
I can see it as useful rhetorically, you know?
Yeah, but that it is the rhetorical use for it and the theoretical use for it is still a blinder to the context in which it was said at the time. And so when you look at that here, you have the same thing. Like, the patrician landholders become the basis of the feudal lord system, because they're the people who had and it's Wickham's advantage to knowing this is that Wickham studies Italy, where you can trace the names directly. Whereas in England, you have the obscurity of like tribal names seeming to change. You have many dominant tribal cultures changing. The name shift with that. It's very hard to trace. You know, I mean, you know, it's the whole thing, like the genetic study of England, when they realize, oh, most of you still are related to the Romano-British, not the Saxons. What happened?
It's like they weren't like ethnically cleansed; they were just intermixed with. Right.
They were just intermixed with people took Saxon names and they became part of that culture. Like true ethnic cleansing, we're discovering happens, but it's a lot rarer than people have previously thought.
Yeah.
I guess what you normally have is more what the United Nations would call cultural genocide, right? Which is the imposition of new cultures. But in Rome, that doesn't happen.
No.
So you can trace this line through, which is something you can't do. And do you think Wickham? I actually haven't read enough Wickham, and it doesn't totally come up in these articles. Was part of Wickham's argument is that the city-state system is because there's still so much of the old pre-Roman or Roman pre-feudal apparatus in the peninsula itself.
You mean the northern city-states during the medieval period?
Yeah.
I don't think he makes that case. If I remember correctly, it seems to just be it's a matter of like contingency due to the fact that it's at an intersecting point of a bunch of different people all trying to exercise their power, like the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantines, who still have control over...
Like Florence is trading between the Holy Romans and the Byzantines a lot.
Yeah, and then Venice is in the Byzantine orbit. You know, there's the Exarchate of Ravenna is the last remaining vestige of Byzantine power on the continent.
And they all
in the northeast,
which is technically also a remaining of Western Roman imperial power too. Technically,
yeah. Well, it's from the Reconquest though,
right?
Established with Justinian's Reconquest.
But the importance of Ravenna is something that a lot of people, because our shitty history teaching, frankly, skips over this time period. That like from the 3rd century forward, Ravenna is actually more important than Rome, particularly after Alaric's sack. I
mean, like
Rome is more symbolically important, right?
Yeah,
like
because of Christianity.
Yeah, reconquering Italy and the way in which each of these individual cities can play the various contenders for the inheritance of Rome, right, off of each other. Like that seems to play a big role in why they remain or grow in importance. But Rome itself is more like it's kind of like reconquering the Holy Land for the Crusaders. You don't really need it, but it's important for your own legitimacy at home.
I mean, and then there's like the Papal States being constantly at odds with the Holy Roman Emperor, and like individual dukes or magnates, whatever, attempting to side with one side over the other in order to be able to exercise the most of their own power. So if you're dominated by the Holy Roman Emperor, you side with the Pope against the Holy Roman Emperor in order to buck the Emperor's power, and vice versa. If you're being dominated by the Pope, you side with the Holy Roman Emperor to buck the Pope's power. And
you see USSR stuff already. Like these dynamics emerge because there's like only so many ways these kind of conflicts can go.
Yeah.
But I mean,
and really with the because of the importance as trade networks, there's this merchant classes rise up and become powerful a lot faster there. And then there's the transition to the commune state,
Right.
who are very interested in not being dominated by other polities that are not part of the commune.
But what's interesting about this too, I think this is interesting just to think about part of our own historical bias in understanding things. We and the Americas tend to focus probably on Spain, France, and England as our understandings of the medieval world because they actually rhyme the most with the modern world. You have something akin to a nation state the way we think of it in all those areas. Although France is kind of a stretch, as is Spain, but still you have something like that. Particularly, and they almost instantly go into, almost modern imperial modes. But that, I think, distorts our view of how the Middle Ages worked in Europe, because this is one of the time periods where ethno-nation states just don't matter, hardly at all.
And they don't anywhere else except for those states until the 19th century.
Right.
Like the Holy Roman Empire or
the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the Holy Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore.
Right, but just look at the Germanic states who have to be conquered by Bismarck in the second half of the 19th century and forced into being considered German. And then you even have separatist movements that have like a significant amount of pull in between the world wars.
Right. So, you have separatist movements that have a significant amount of pull now.
Yeah. That's one of the ways that Hitler made himself known is by shouting down Bavarian separatists in a packed beer hall and saying we're all Germans and blah 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 and shit like that, and getting people riled up over that issue.
So, I mean, it's interesting because we've seen these. Ironically, one of the things that the EU has allowed is for some of these separatist movements in other areas, such as like the northern Italian city-states or Scotland, or to seemingly emerge back out again because they're being part of the EU makes them part of a larger political unit than being part of the nation state that they currently live in. But what I find interesting is like in this time period, if you look at that conception, you don't really understand England and France either, but you can kind of make sense of them from this national mythos. But it totally messes up our understanding even of modern European history. Because the American synthetic nation idea has also like glommed us to believe that like, oh, all these nations are really old. Like Germany is a really old nation. And I'm like,
nope,
it's a really old language. And the unification of the language is also fairly modern, buddy. And if you've ever spent time in Germany, not that thorough, similar to Italian, like the unification of Italy is almost 20th century and not complete.
I was going to say it's Italy's unification is ongoing.
Right.
Yeah, it's in a way that Americans would be completely unable to recognize. They have slang and cultural cuisine that does not translate from city to city. Even if it's just like 125 miles that way is a different city where they have different slang and they eat different food than we do. And they're pigs.
Yeah.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is actually, though, this is part of how pervasive our bourgeois national myth is. We have that in the States too, really. We do.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in some ways, that actually does kind of I don't want to say undermine.
It doesn't undermine it because our national mythos is so strong that we don't recognize it. Except like I hate Alabamians because I'm from Georgia, and I
live about 45 minutes south of the Oklahoma border, over which there's nothing redeemable. So
right, exactly. Like if I refer to people from southern Georgia as Greater Bamians, it's an insult. So
what it undermines, though, is the idea that we were just arguing, that we were just putting forward, that the national unification is somewhat let's say, we believe that it's more of a myth than it is reality, because actually every unified nation is also just made up of potentially fragmentary pieces. Like this country's unification process includes an enormous amount of let's say we had a debate about the degree of autonomy each state's gonna have.
Yeah, I mean, particularly you're in like locus zero for that being a live issue.
Yep.
Since you're one of the few states that has even a tenuous claim to have been a quote nation state unquote before becoming a state. Although that's also kind of a joke.
Mostly a joke.
But to tie this back though to why this makes understanding this period of history, this end of Rome, really hard. So I think we have a tendency now to view Rome as a cohesive kind of imperial quasi-nation state with a very unified internal culture and
like ethnically Latin.
Yeah, ethnically Latin, somewhat homogeneously white by our modern standards, which I know this is a debate in classics right now, but I don't even like referring to people in Europe before the 17th century as white because it's confusing.
Right. It doesn't make any sense. And I mean, like, you saw the whole debate on Twitter with Mary Beard, right?
Right.
Talking about whether or not there were actually black people in Britain during the
right. Which the answer to that is sort of.
There were dark-skinned people living in Britain because they were brought there by the legions and
right.
They settled there. Right. Were they black? No, that concept didn't exist yet. So yeah.
Right, exactly. Right. You know, they might have been. The closest thing we have to a category of blackness is the category of Ethiopian, right?
Yeah.
Now there are portrayals in like late Roman imperials. I was listening to a podcast on Nonus's Dionysiaca lately because that's the kind of stuff I do in my spare time. And but it's directly relevant to that. I was listening to it actually partly in preparation to the literature around this time period, like the end of the Roman Empire, because this is the longest epic. It's the last pagan epic, but it's from the period where the Western Roman Empire is more or less over. And what I got from that is you don't start seeing vilifications of the other tied to complexion until around that time period, and it's inconsistent. And it's weird because it actually stands out because you don't see it in Roman literature during the height of the empire. It's not there. So like you don't see them talking about Indians as a dark, and it's Indians for some weird reason who they're portraying. They portray them as black, but they don't use those terminology because they wouldn't. It's just the description.
Yeah.
And Nonus. But it's interesting that that's coming at a period of distress and decline, and you don't see any evidence of that during Rome's heyday. And what I like to remind people of, the majority of Rome was not in Europe. It was in North Africa.
North Africa and the Middle East. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, but not in terms of population, but in terms of space, mostly in North Africa. Like, because I'm like, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, that's all Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and like, you know, even before the Muslim Christian conflicts in Iberia, you have like Celts and North Africans meeting all the time in Spain and in the Visigothic kingdoms. Mm-hmm. So to think of Rome as proto-Europe, that's actually kind of a 19th century myth that like Germans and the English really wanted to push out. More the English actually, but still, the Germans were bigger than the Greeks. But we tend to read that back in time and interpret literature from that time period that way. And Wickham is a good check against that, because if you read Wickham about what's happening at the end of the Roman Empire, you can't do that because it's not going to make sense.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna quote Wickham because we haven't yet, like maybe in 2 episodes.
It's about time.
This is from page 4 of Past and Present Other Transitions, which is the primary article that we're talking about. And maybe we can go into this. The standard interpretation of economic changes of late Rome is that the slave mode of production gives way to the feudal mode of production, that slavery is replaced by serfdom. The classic modern formulation of this in non-Marxist terms is that of Marc Bloch in his posthumous article, I Can't Say Anything French. Comment
pour qui finit l'esclavage antique. I can't do French either, but
so I think it's comment on the end of the antique savages is what that actually probably translates to. From my knowledge of Romance languages, non-French.
Mine is Latin, and
we'll go with that. That seems right.
Which dominated the attitudes of medievalists for 2 decades or more. No mean achievement for a 25-page summary of an article without notes, which is funny. That article is also mentioned in Carlo Ginzburg on microhistory because apparently it is super important. Block pointed out the tremendous increase in the numbers of slaves during the Great Wars of the 5th to 6th centuries AD, but showed how they were not enrolled in the traditional slave plantations characteristic of the Augustinian Italy. So, okay, this is interesting. This is actually different from my understanding. Those slaves became tenants. At some point, then the plantations had broken down, and the slaves were put in tenant plots. As the position of free tenants declined, serfdom was born from the fusion of the two social groups. Now, we have to admit, slavery is a really broad category because when we talk about ancient slaves, we always think of chattel slavery, and that's not really correct.
No.
But serfdom's even broader. Like how bonded you are to the land, whether you're bonded to the land or to the Lord, is actually varies greatly. How bonded you are varies greatly. How much power the Lord has over you varies greatly. So what would be the consistent tenet of serfdom?
The consistent tenet is that there's some agreement that binds you to extracting wealth and giving a portion of it to the Lord, and you're not able to leave freely.
Right.
You've got some sort of agreement, because there's always an agreement between the Lord and the serf. It's not just like slavery where the one owns the other. It's a different form of the suzerain vassal relationship, but downwards, right? So the serf owes a portion of the extraction from the land to the Lord, and the Lord owes the serf protection, justice, etc. The things that governments do.
So the difference between a serf and a peasant is that a peasant has no bonds.
Right. A free peasant has no bond.
Right.
Yeah.
A serf has got some sort of bond. A free peasant is probably renting the land or owns his own land.
Right. Because we get to why isn't, for example, sharecropping in the South a feudal relation?
Well, that's
actually a debate too.
I was going to say that is a debate. I do think that's the right way to think of it, is that it is not a feudal relation. But the question is a good one: is why isn't it? I don't know if we ought to spend any time.
No,
on that.
I don't want to get. But it's why this question is important here. So
right.
when we say serfdom, we mean there's a bond that it is legal and it is religious, but it has profound economic implications. Right? Like what makes the bond sacred between the serf and the Lord is imprimatur by the church. That's one thing. And that it is legally binding, like you can enforce it. Yeah. But we also have to remember, this is a time period where there really isn't anything like an independent police force.
No.
I mean, police don't come into the 18th century. Sheriffs are a late medieval thing, but they're actually the institution of sheriff is communal tax collection actually originally. So
yeah, and it's specifically British,
right? And it's English. Unique to Britain to the English, and that's where we get our early notions of law enforcement from. But
where there's things like a night watch that exists just to make sure that that's when people get up to bad stuff. So a night watch goes around and makes sure that things aren't happening. And then for pretty much outside of that, any kind of law enforcement that happens is an individual brings up someone else on charges and has the burden of proof upon them to be able to prove those charges in a court. Right, and there's no prosecutor. And then whoever is arrested and thrown into jail, it's up to them to maintain themselves while in jail because they're not going to be fed otherwise. They have to have their family bring them food, stuff like that. So it's completely
which
privatized.
is why jail is really rare too. Yeah. Actually, going to jail is actually not that common. Most punishments for the poor are physical.
Right. Yeah. There's no prison. Prison doesn't exist except for in the dungeons of the king, you could throw your political enemies in there and whatnot.
Yeah, but that's not going to affect most poor people actually.
No. Yeah. You lose a finger or an eye or
you get your ear nailed to the door. You're whipped. Yeah. Right.
You're trussed up in public for a few days or whatever.
Right. And I want to bring this up too in this time period. I do want to say though that we often think of early modern English punishments and French punishments as the standard for medieval period, and they were particularly brutal. That's flaying, that's boiling people in oil. That's actually really rare to be implied to anyone other than noble enemies as kind of an inter-equal terror tactic during this time period. It doesn't come up a lot.
Yeah, it existed, but it was incredibly rare.
Right. It's actually, that's generally true, it seems, of the way in which we have an understanding in a popular conception of what the Middle Ages were, and I think that it has to do with like Enlightenment criticisms of early modern sort of jurisprudence and social structures and political
then counter
formations.
Enlightenment criticisms of that also tend to make it sound like, so like you think about Foucault, well, people put that Foucauldian description back in time about sovereignty, and I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't apply to most people.
Right, exactly. Like when the French National Assembly in 1789 votes to abolish feudal privileges, and they like formally abolish feudalism, and that's like their task. We read that as things which have survived since the end of the Roman Empire, rather than kind of weird, bastardized, hybrid, leftover aspects of feudal privileges, which have carried over into the way the aristocracy operates in the early modern period.
Yeah, and
so most of our conception of the Middle Ages is actually early capitalism, rather than, or not early capitalism, early
capitalism transition period. Like,
yeah, that's right.
I think we tend to think about, like, also people will mention like divine right of kings and absolute kingship. I'm like, nope, and nope, neither exist. And I mean, divine right of kings kind of does, but not really.
Yeah, there's the idea of absolutism barely exists.
Yeah, that's totally almost modern. Like,
and it's exactly. It barely exists, if at all. In fact,
that's part of the transition away from absolutism is one of the steps along the road toward what we think of as modernity.
And it can be argued that one of the most absolutist states that exists in the early modern period is the British state, and it's Parliament that has absolute authority, not the king.
Right.
So it's like these categories are all fucked up and misunderstood.
And so clarifying that here, we have this beginning with Block, but what we realized pretty quickly, even with Block, and I'm going to read more from good old Wickham here, because Wickham's doing excellent historiography, and if for no other reason than understanding the history of the Middle Ages, read a Wickham article, because he's going to explain it to you in like a couple paragraphs instead of you having to read like 50 books. So this is interesting. In particular, the whole pattern keys in very badly with the known and general accepted with the rest of Roman history. If feudal relationships already existed in AD 300, then what was the late Roman state? If the latter was not feudal, as it does not seem to have been, then what fills in the gaps, and how? Moses Finley, who ought to know, if anyone does, has declared himself defeated. I'm unable to fit late antiquity into any neat series of stages, he says at the end of his most recent book. But slave society did not immediately give way to feudal society, which is interesting to me because it's relevant to what we saw in the beginnings of capitalism. There is no moment, even the French Revolution or the American Revolution, where I can say there is a clear end of the capitalist period and the beginning of the capitalist period and an end of early modern absolutism or late medieval feudal relations, etc. I mean, you still have feudalism existing in Sicily until the 20th century. And to be fair, even though Britain is ground zero for the bourgeois revolutions, I think every Marxist agrees with that, it also still has, of the bourgeois states, the most medieval social relations still built there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the 20th century towns, like villages, and people that exist on the land of the Lord being, governed by the Lord and existing under their patronage.
That really only ends after World War II.
An uninterrupted line back to the medieval period.
Yeah, I think this is probably going to be helpful for discussing the transition to feudalism as well, but it's a little easier to conceive of in the transition to capitalism. I think Marx does us a favor and a disservice by giving us a really neat periodization, which is the class struggle between these two classes, which produces this, and then there's each of them has their own political structure.
Right, and his periodizations, let's be fair, he pulled from someone else.
Yeah,
and his dynamic for how it works is different.
Yeah, but they also are extremely limited because we tend to, and maybe it's subconsciously, but it really does affect our ability to think these things through. We tend to think of these things as the bourgeois revolution was when the bourgeoisie made a revolution and made capitalism and made a democratic republic, as if it was an event,
right?
Rather than that the development of the mode of production internal to a previously existing mode of production gave rise to a social layer, which worms its way through the administrative apparatus, starts to have an impact on the state, eventually comes up against the limitations of that superstructure, tries to change it, and in the process of doing so, unleashes, gets rid of more fetters on the development of the furtherance of the motor production itself. So they kind of leapfrog each other. Like the bourgeois revolution it's not like there's a group of people who are like, what would be great is if we had a capitalist mode of production. So we're going to overthrow the feudal aristocrats and make a new thing. No one's conscious of ushering in a new mode of production. They're merely expressions of one which is already in motion.
So, for example, like even in the British case, the mode of production already exists for about 100 years before you see the English Civil War.
Yeah.
That's why England is a capitalist state with a leftover feudal aristocracy afterward as well.
I was about to say, like, the English Civil War isn't like the smashing of the feudal institutions. It's just like sort of the shuffling around of the feudal institutions,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's to it's to bring them to heel, right? So
that
capitalist mode of production prevails over them.
Which I think should make Marxists uncomfortable, because it does mean that some of the liberal claims, for example, that the USSR still has elements of czarist political economy in it, something that we should say, well, duh.
Well, who else said that was Lenin said that.
Right. I know, but a lot of people are uncomfortable with Lenin about with some things that, like, for example, people like to talk about Lenin and state capitalism as either like he knew the left comms were right the whole time, or that state capitalism is just it's part of what socialism is, and neither are true really, even in Lenin. I
think Lenin's writing some things down that he's recognizing, and he's unhappy about it. But in retrospect, that like elements of the former society are going to continue to survive because we haven't moved past their utility.
Right.
And
which is
I think now we're able to say, yeah, that's what happens in every historical transition.
Right. Which is something that Marx kind of gloms onto, unfortunately, only in one sentence in the Critique of the Goethe program.
Yeah.
Which everybody interprets as, there's still markets in socialism, which is not what it says. It says elements of bourgeois society will still exist. Because elements of feudal society, and in Marx's time, this is undeniable. He's writing in Germany. Elements of feudal society still exist when he's writing it.
Yeah.
And the transition to capitalism.
Right. So, and are an active impediment to modernization, for lack of a better term, I guess.
Right. It leads to some weirdnesses in Marxism that are hard to explain otherwise. Like, we're opposed to nationalism except when we're not.
Right.
Well, nationalism is a way to break up these large feudal empires, and thus it has, and the Marxist assumption, which I think was wrong, but the Marxist assumption was that nationalism would just go away afterwards due to economic development. And I think that's funny because it's basically the same thing the globalization arguments were making like 10 years ago, but for capitalism.
And yet it persists, and maybe for a reason, which is doesn't matter how uncomfortable it is, it just is, right?
Well,
and Wickham makes this argument, right, when he talks about I wanted to bring this up before. I don't think we did this. We should just give Wickham's definition of feudalism.
Let's do that. We haven't done that yet, actually.
Yeah,
I've given Mark Bloch's definition, kind of.
I gotta find this for a moment. Page 6.
Yep.
I'm going to read a passage real quick, and I think this connects to what we were just saying. Trust me. He says that feudalism, classically understood, means serfdom and coercive political authority. And then he says that I can't read my handwriting. Hindus. Hindus and Hirsch, who are two Althusserian structuralists who give up on Marxism eventually. He says that they say that this is too narrow. Feudalism just means tenants paying rents to monopolistic landowners, which is sort of what Chris said before, right? That without necessarily codifying the powers of the seigneury, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with vassalage, military obligations, or the fief, right? All the culture and superstructure that grows out of and sort of defines the late Middle Ages, the late fully developed feudalism. But so the reason why that's important, I guess, is only because if the necessary features of feudalism are just tenants paying rents to a monopolistic landowner, you could see how that's an element of late ancient Rome that survives all the way into the modern capitalist world, because those are feudal social relations. But what we call feudalism is everything that is built upon that structure.
Right, and it's important to think about the land structure of ancient Rome here. So the state, as in the Senate, granted you use rights to land and quote ownership. That's what, like, how you would reward soldiers and whatnot is land, but it was part of what the res publica, right, which was a quasi state. What I find interesting about this is, like, it makes capitalist weirdos like Hans Hermann Hoppe say feudalism is just, the privatization of government, to be somewhat correct. Because the manorial landholders and their relationship to the king, whose kingdom, all right, everything is in lieu of, like, so there's a kingdom of God and a kingdom of man, but the kingdom is literally the ownership whole of the king. He owns it and is leasing it to his lords, who lease it to you.
Property in the Middle Ages is held in usufruct, right?
Right.
And that is a direct holdover, even in terminology, from the late Roman Empire.
Right. And so what's interesting, for example, if you read Adam Smith, who's Adam Smith's greatest enemy? The rentier state. And the rentiers. It's not the state per se. It's rentierism, which he sees as a fetter in capital and on free development of labor. And so this leads to, like, Chomsky saying, well, Adam Smith would have been a leftist, which, okay, sort of, but not really. Like, but
in England, kind of.
Yes.
It's a lot like the debate about were the Romans white or black. It's like,
it doesn't really mean anything.
It's a concept that didn't exist at the time.
Right. Transhistoricism is totally useless. Like, why do it?
Right.
Yeah, it's not even like it. It's not even.
It's usually rhetorical expediency is why people do it, but but anyway, I think this is interesting here though, because it does explain a lot. But I think Wickham having to Wickham's definition, I think, holds more than Hindus and Hearst's does, which will hurt my Altusarian friends, but good.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, and the other thing that Wickham says around this same, I think it's not even on this same page, and it also ties into the conversation we were just having. It's just to sum it up, it says it's important to remember that modes of production are ideal constructs. It's somewhat difficult to determine how they work, like, on the ground, and how they articulate the superstructural aspects of society.
They're reifications in the literal sense.
Yeah.
Like,
the mode of production is clear to us. Well, clear in the sense that we're able to argue about it for decades about what it means, well after it's gone.
Right.
Or not even gone, but just well after it no longer prevails.
I think it's actually very useful for a mistake that comes up in Marxism all the time, where we're trying to, like, guess what mode of capitalism that we're in at any time period while it's happening, and we're almost always wrong, even though we are often right that there has been a shift in the production relations that are profound. These examples that we can bring up in the 20th century was the diffusion of capital ownership, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which some people thought solved the contradictions of capitalism and led to the administrative society or the managerial elite, whether, the administrative society is the left version of that from Pollock and the Frankfurt School. The managerial society is the right post-Trotskyist version from Burnham. But that idea is actually common throughout the era, even in people like Christopher Lasch. And then, like, they're blindsided when neoliberalism starts, right? They're totally blindsided. And now we define everything as neoliberal, right?
Right.
I think neoliberalism's ending.
Do you?
I do. I think I think the neoliberalization that we've seen. One, I think most people's definition of neoliberalism is stupid. Like, they think it just means free market capitalism, and that's not what it means.
No.
Two, I think it's ending because it's not profitable anymore. But I don't. Everyone, a year ago, everybody was talking about, and I'm on a date when we're saying this, even though we tend to release these pretty fast, but in November of 2021, so people listen in the future, in 2020, everybody was predicting an age of neo-Fordism under Biden, which is laughable. But what we are seeing is that old neoliberalism isn't gone away, but it also isn't predominantly what's driving development right now.
No, it's like a bastard hybrid form of, like, it's what neoliberalism does, though. Is it like, it's like, our strict adherence to this set of principles that we've previously been adhering to isn't working, so we'll bring in an element of something else. Right. And whether or not that changes the entire system into a new method of, like, orienting is yet to be seen. I've just been under the assumption, and you can tell me what you think of this, that this is a hiccup in neoliberalism.
I am under the assumption that for capitalism as a whole to rebound from its current profitability crisis, for us not to enter something like a terminal collapse, this can't be a hiccup. However, I also think it's crucial here when looking, and this is where looking at the ancient past can help us. Most of the elements of neoliberalism aren't going to go away. What I think is changing is how much of it is dependent on rentier relations, which oddly rhymes with the end of antiquity.
Yeah.
This is where like people, I think hyperbolically and incorrectly are talking about like modern neo-feudalism, but this is a rational core of that, where I do think there is a point in the expansion of rentier relations across the board. That's not supposed to be part of neoliberalism. Rents aren't actually supposed to be that huge deal of it. But you're still going to see all the rest of it. So we might be living in the worst of all worlds, frankly. But then don't we always conclude that? Like,
well, look, I don't know if we always conclude that, but I will say if it feels, and I think it does for most people, like we are currently living in the worst of all worlds, it's not without reason. It may very well be.
I mean, there might be worlds that are worse.
Yeah. Well, at least considering what our expectations have been, whether you're a liberal or whatever your ideal future is, this isn't it.
Right, and everyone's expectations are diminished. And again, this is a good comparison to this time period in antiquity. Yeah. This is why I think when we feel like we might be living through a transition that we can't name or see, and it's unfortunately not to communism, it doesn't seem like, at least not at the
Probably
moment.
Not.
I think when you look at the ancient world, I think Umberto Eco makes an interesting argument about this, actually, that like he thought the 80s, that the real parallel to the 80s was not the Enlightenment, was not the Renaissance. It was late medievalism, which
That's
is a wild argument, but it's because you feel like you're in a bunch of stalled transitions. So to get to this, though, I love this quote. And this is on the same page. The feudal mode, the other one that concerns us, has much traditional Marxist analysis that has been based on serfdom, and that constituted political authority and is constituted by I can't say that word, blah, blah, blah. We already read that. But what he talks about is the focus on physical force being part of this.
Yeah.
So one of the explanations, for example, is why England, and this is from the Brennerites, why England became the dominant commercial power and not Spain, which both embark on early modern settler colonial contrasts, is that England focuses on reinvestment and Spain focuses on investment and physical extraction because it is still operating on a feudal mode.
Spain also, right before it embarks on its imperial conquests, eviscerates its middle class.
Yes, it destroys it.
Yes, by kicking all the Jews and Muslims out of the country.
It actually pretty much gave them all either to France or to the Ottoman Empire. So
there's nobody to reinvest their capital with.
Right. So what they invest in is extraction, pure extraction, right? Which the English actually use as part of their propaganda for their colonism being different than Spain's settler colonialism at the time, because we're like, we invest stuff. Those Spanish just kill people and make them slaves. I mean, we also take slaves and bring them over, but whatever.
But the Spanish only do that.
Right.
And they do it superstitiously.
Right. And they're doing it because they're dirty Catholics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's right. Well, it makes a difference. This, I know we've been spending a lot of time just in this one section of the essay, but I think
it's super important.
Yeah. And I think a whole lot of what will undergird like every discussion about transition that we ever have is all on this page, right? Like, I think we've said it, but just in case it hasn't been made clear, I want to read it. It hasn't been made clear for the listener. I want to read one more passage off of page 6 from Wickham, which is just, to me, this is a case that I think we want to make, unless there's a secret disagreement that will come out, which is just that societies often have more than one mode of production operative at the same time. And he gives examples, but between one mode and the other, there is an eventual break. When they coexist for a time, the dominant one will determine the ground rules for the whole social formation. He gives more examples. But eventually, the dominant mode either conquers or else undermines the state form and changes it, right? And then in quotes, I put in parentheses, I put through class struggle. The feudal mode of production can be said to be dominant, to prevail, right? When the feudal state form had supplanted the classical state form. So that's just a summary of basically all the conversation up to this point. That's really the process we're trying to uncover and make sense of.
Again, to understand transitions here, In the United States, there's this big debate, and there has been the big debate: is slavery an aberration of capitalism, or is it necessary for capitalism? And what this would indicate is, both.
Right.
Like,
embrace the contradictions.
I was going to say, my response is that we're not thinking fourth dimensionally.
Right. I mean, like, it is both a callback to a prior form, which is modernized by capitalist technology, which accelerates capitalist accumulation in a way they couldn't do in Europe by itself, which really makes capitalism able to spread throughout the world, but also is not sustainable within capitalism. There's a reason why it breaks down into civil wars, etc. Now, Marx did lay out the idea that it could have maintained, but it would have been this new thing. Like, if slave society had existed for a long time. Yeah.
There are arguments that I've heard that the slave society of the South could have existed in perpetuity because it was so profitable. And they point to the Nazi extraction of surplus value of slave labor. But, I mean, even a cursory look at of how productive slave labor is as compared to wage labor in the Nazi experience puts the lie to that. Like, immediately, it's slaves are unreliable laborers, and they're expensive to keep, and they die.
Yeah. Right.
You either treat them well, and it's too expensive, or you don't, and they die.
To put this in capitalist terms, a worker is always variable capital.
Yeah.
A slave begins as variable capital and becomes fixed capital, because eventually you can only extract what they can physically do without killing them. And if you extract more than that, you kill them, and that's a loss of the investment.
Right. And like all fixed capital, it breaks down.
Right. And it's specifically in a modern context where you've got slaves that have to be trained to use machinery. They have like technical skills. They have to be educated, Variable capital gets really expensive to replace.
Right. So, I mean, it's one of these things where it actually, if you think about it from the standpoint of Marxism, it is a rational choice in the beginning and an irrational choice in the end.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning of a slave process, they're going to outcompete wage laborers.
Yeah.
But only at the beginning, right?
So the more advanced the machinery gets, the harder it gets to maintain slaves, the hard to train and house. And
exactly.
feed. Yeah.
Well, and it's also like, if you look at the Roman Imperium, you look at the American South, and you look at Nazi Germany, the slavery as a labor regime ultimately falls apart on the same rocks, right? It crashes on the same rocks, which is the necessity of expansion, which means this is a wartime economy.
Yeah, it can only be maintained by a wartime economy. Am I right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We didn't even consider the fact that it stultifies innovation.
Right.
Yeah.
And there comes a point where if not everyone is a slave society, then you are being eclipsed technologically, because, I mean, labor-saving devices lead to other sorts of expansions of technological
right, which is why innovation. the South is so poor, in addition to the North deliberately underdeveloping it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is important too for why on earth would all these landholders like move people to serfdom from slavery when slaves just have to do what you freaking tell them to? Well, one, slaves can free themselves. Actually, serfs can't.
Yeah, I was actually mentioning that to Jason before. I was like, Roman slaves are actually more free than medieval serfs. Late medieval serfs, specifically.
Yeah. Early medieval serfs are a little different, but like they can't too. There's less reason for them to, because their subsistence is tied to the work they're doing. And so if the Lord treats them with even a modicum of noblesse oblige, which they usually didn't, but when they did, there's a stronger bond of loyalty than you would ever possibly have with the blatant antagonism with slavery.
Mm-hmm. Or between the wage laborer and the capitalist.
Right.
But even then, like, serfdom is... So earlier we were talking about how, like, serfdom is a kind of a varied experience across the part of the world where you see it. It's also, like slavery, becomes, in a lot of ways, it's like a different thing by the time you get to its latest expression.
Right.
So, like, serfdom in the Russian Empire in the 1850s and 60s.
Is closer to slavery than any other kind of serfdom.
Right. It's like American chattel slavery, which is not like ancient slavery. Ancient slavery is more like indentured servitude.
Right.
And both of those are much more like early serfdom. Well, it sounds like a big mess. Which is why I think what the argument that Wickham makes about the way that the dominant mode of production overdetermines and sets the rules for everything that's subservient to it. So that, like, you can see how slavery in the American South is conditioned by the needs of the development of capital in the non-slave states, right? And makes it into a thing which arguably deserves its own name, except for that it is still technically slavery, even if it's not at all like the old slavery. And the same thing with Russian serfdom in the development of Russian capitalism. It starts to take on a different character. For, like, Russian landowners could sell their serfs to each other. That French and English landowners don't do that, at least as far as I'm aware, and throughout the entire period of what we call feudalism.
Well, the way that you could tell that there was a greater amount of freedom is by looking at points where there wasn't. So if you look at, like, the peasant uprising of 1381 in England, you see that comes as a direct result of movement controls being put on serfs, so that they couldn't leave and go into the city and get a job there. They couldn't go onto another noble's land and work for better wages. So they're locked into place, and that is after. It's during the Black Death, right? So labor is harder to come by, and people are paying better wages. So peasants get locked in to the land of their ancestral land, and that is an arresting of rising expectations, which leads to the English peasant revolt, right?
Right. But it's interesting what the peasant revolt appeals to, because again, we think of it as a standing up against tyranny, but it's a standing up against noble tyranny. They actually make vast appeals towards the king.
Oh yeah, the peasants march to appeal to the king against the nobles. Yeah, that's the way that medieval peasant brains work. It's like, right. Clearly the king, who's given to us by God, must not know what's going on. Rarely do you ever get a situation where the peasants are actually trying to destroy the concept of nobility in general.
Right. Someone tell Comrade Stalin that the commissars are mistreating us.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was about to say, there's a whole lot of that in the ex-peasant mindset in the USSR, beyond just Stalin, where you see appeals to the central government against local bureaucrats, often the bureaucrats who actually come from the same class origin as the people protesting them. You also see that in China. So
I was going to say, yeah, what's funny is that the example par excellence is the Cultural Revolution.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is also not exactly mirrored, but Wickham talks about the budding aristocracy, or the landed aristocracy in the Roman provinces. As he says it's not like a class you want to think of as heroic in the sense of it waging a class struggle. But it really is, in the sense that, like, the state power in ancient Rome is the locus of exploitation, and that the aristocracy are actually, like, resisting, trying to break out of shackles placed upon them by the state power,
by hiding their profitability so they don't have to pay taxes.
Right, and so, like, local peoples who are under the direct rule of the aristocrats of these, like, kind of proto or whatever, these people who would in later period would be like feudal barons, actually find it easier to have an allegiance to them than it is to the Roman state.
Have you gotten to the point in The Inheritance of Rome, Jason, where he talks about the some of the noble landowners actually preferring barbarian to Roman rule, and actually being a huge part of how easily the barbarians were able to conquer previously Roman lands?
And I think earlier I was slightly misspeaking just a moment ago, because what I was trying to say was it's the local landowners who seem to identify more with the barbarian incursions, and it's the people directly under them that are, like, kind of still have a fealty to the Roman state as their protectors. At any rate, we should figure out how to talk about the role of the Roman state in this period.
Yeah, that's the kind of elephant in the room, though, because what is a Roman state exactly, particularly in this period? Because there are massive changes in the Roman state between the 1st and 4th century.
Mm-hmm. Well, so he talks about the classical method of wealth extraction being one of taxation.
Yeah, taxation of land, basically.
Taxation of land. And he says that this is happening simultaneously to this rent economy, this feudal economy that's growing up, and that taxation is just changing the focus of who it is that's taxed. So it's not the latifundia owners anymore, right? But that these two systems are in competition with one another.
Yeah, he sort of describes like it's in the 4th century that as an official you would gain more by holding public office than by holding land.
Yeah.
But by the 6th century, the opposite's true. The shift happens sometime in the middle of the 5th century. At this point, it's actually kind of hard to like exactly pinpoint, but it does seem to take place over the 5th century where the public power ceases to actually have power in anything but a formal sense, because now it's landowners directly who have, who actually have power.
And the shift there is when the land tax previously was first taken directly from all free cultivators. And then it shifted in the 370s to landlords.
Yeah.
Right. So
And
what
in
you're
the
seeing
fifth
is the end of the Res Publica, basically.
Right.
Yeah. That's the real end of Rome. So that the decline of the Roman Empire, you could maybe even say, starts with that. Even if all up to now we've been talking about the preconditions for its decline.
Yeah, because the Res Publica, for people who don't know, we always think of republic, but it means the common holding or the public holding of property, not just land, but mostly land, right, and rights, etc. But it's what it is. So it's like the commonwealth, and commonwealth in Res Public means what it sounds like in the way, not in the abstract way we use it. Means it's the commonly held wealth.
Yeah.
As opposed to like some abstract name of a state.
Yeah.
And that's over by what, the 5th century, we think?
Yeah.
At least by Wickham's argument?
It's at least, if it's not entirely over, it's at least very clearly on the way out by the 5th century.
And so I think to contextualize this, though, like when you think of the primary method of wealth extraction being taxation, then you're like, so what? The government has a lot of money. How does that help the economy? How does the economy function if the government is just extracting all the money? It's because the government runs commerce, right?
Everybody gets a salary. It's paid by the government in Rome.
Yeah. So all trade networks are set up and maintained by the government. All commerce that happens in the big cities is directly set up and run by the government. Everything.
Private property is just the private holdings of a family and of the family economy in early Rome.
Yeah, the government, of course, builds the roads. The government imports and gives away free bread to people in the big cities because they don't have the means to buy it on their own.
Well, and because they have the money in the sense of like the coinage is based on the wealth of the state, they also pay the armies which defend the provinces.
It's where the term salary comes from, is the salt paid to the army. No, so this is interesting though, because it's important to notice the only independent actors are going to be familiar landholders, which would be the paterfamilias system, which is like the household economy. And we need to emphasize this is not a nuclear family. This is a household economy with slaves, servants, farms, etc., and then merchants. Everybody, and the merchants are dependent on the state in so much that the merchants are dependent on the infrastructure of the state.
Yeah.
The merchants are dependent upon the state in the same way they are during the NEP in the Soviet Union.
Right. So they are dependent on the infrastructure of the state, but it's important to realize that everybody else, whether high or low, and when you're not talking about the household economy, is directly dependent on the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't think people understand that when they deal with Rome, frankly.
No, because and that's critical to Wickham's entire argument for how this transition happens. Because he says that basically by the time you get to the point where like the taxes that pay to the central state are no longer like the primary means of like basically administering society, the entire continuity of state functions break.
Well, there's a lot of misunderstandings in modern arguments, too, that I think we can understand. So they always talk about how, like, ancient republics were very imperialistic. Well, of course they were. Because expanding upon private holdings and foreign holdings is the way you increase the holdings of the state, even if you increase the dependees of the state. So, like, it's a totally rational calculation, which that's not going to be true for feudal societies where because the only people who directly benefit from the expansion of the feudal state is the king, are nobles who can increase their holdings to try to become the king.
Yeah, that's right. That's why they're like these. The fief becomes the political expression of fully mature feudal social relations. Right.
So there's there actually isn't an expansionist tendency at the bottom in the way there is in Roman society. are in the middle. I mean, because the slaves are at the bottom and they're not going to benefit. But here's the thing, though, because of the manumission system, they might, and that's the other
true.
promise. This is why slave revolts are not as common as you might predict.
Right,
Like,
because the more the more the imperium expands, and the greater the amount of wealth it is to kind of have in your region, the more likely you are to be able to move out of the category, because new people way at the edges are going to be the new slaves.
Right, which is different from this is why Rome doesn't develop into a Spartan hillet system or something like that. All right.
Yeah.
Again, we have to be good historical materialism to looking at what are the optimal choices created by the social relationship, and this is also why when people talk about modes of production and don't look at relations of production, they're usually making fundamental errors. Because all these relationships they're not, you can't separate the relations from the mode at all. And this is why. Because why is Rome so stable? Why are there not more civil and social wars? Right? The concept of civil and social wars comes from Rome. Social wars are between classes. Civil wars are within classes and the state. But why are they so rare? And that is actually because everyone, even down to the slave, because of the possibility of manumission, can actually possibly benefit from the expansion of the Roman state. It is not as irrational as it seems to us from the outside now.
Even the conquered can be assimilated into the state and become citizens and thus have rights. And
when the state starts to break down is when you actually start seeing ethnic tensions dramatically increase in the Roman Empire. It is not from the period of the early Roman Empire where ethnic tensions exist in the beginning. They exist during the end of the Republic, and then they exist at the end of the Empire. They're not common during the Empire because everyone can get in. Like if you're a Gallian, minor noble, you can be included. And when there are rebellions, and British Rome, it's because that contract has been violated in some crucial way. Usually because of over extraction from Britain to Rome, but that's not the norm.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't see 1,000 Boudicas.
Yeah, that's true. Because all of the, I think it doesn't take much to know all the most important figures of resistance against Rome, whether they're Spartacus or Boudica, because there aren't, like you said, there aren't a ton of them. There are a lot, but it's also, we're talking about many centuries of time.
There are a lot of emperors that get proclaimed by their troops and start civil wars.
Yeah,
are just those
civil
really
wars are different from
resistance.
social wars, in Rome, which
for sure.
We don't. Modern terminology doesn't separate those two things out, but
there are groups of barbarians that are let into the empire that are mistreated by the Romans that rise up in revolt. And that is essentially the story of the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Right.
That's what happens with the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals.
Right. I mean, Alaric wants to be Roman. Like Alaric, wants to be Roman, and he's a Christian. I mean, yes, he's a heretical Christian from the Roman standpoint, but he's a Christian too. And that's kind of why they didn't just wipe Rome off the map. Is because of this, because they're still it's still aspirationally important to the German invaders, because they want to prove that we're part of your culture too. Yeah, asshole.
Yeah, I mean, the Romans would let them in, use them as mercenaries, promise them land, and then not give it to them, or try to kill them all because they get scared of them.
Or use them as shock troops, right? So what you start seeing is, as there's stress on Rome, as its taxation systems start to really fall down, frankly, it starts betraying the rules of the game. And what people are rebelling against is not the game, but that actually people are keeping what they believe to be their end of the deal. That's true of Boudica too. Even though she's, there's this 18th century tendency to turn all these figures into early nationalist figures. What they're mad about is that Rome did not go within the bonds of understood relations with peoples that are subject to Rome. They're not mad that Rome exists, right? Not at the period that we're talking about.
Okay, so listen to this. The quantitative dominance of tax collecting in the empire, even wherein it was in opposition to rent, is as clear as it is ever likely to be, given the figures usually at our disposal for the late empire. Independent peasants paid at least the rates outlined in these texts, and often more. At such levels, over a quarter of gross yields will have gone in tax. At a guess, often over half the surplus, and certainly over 100% of the surplus in bad years. So the tax system becomes untenable because it's completely extracting all of the surplus from landowners.
Which means that there's nothing left for people to survive in their system.
Right.
And it's not able to provide enough back to people to incentivize them to be loyal to the state.
Why does this happen, though?
Why does it happen? Well, some of it has to do with the overexpansion of the empire. But
he's taken. This is from Egypt, I think,
which was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. People need to know that too. Yeah.
So when the Vandals capture Egypt, or when the Vandals capture North Africa, the breadbasket of Europe of the empire, that it's essentially spells doom for the urban centers of the empire.
There's not enough excess grain to produce food for the urban centers. Yeah. There's no way. So when the Vandals, even I always like, oh, Vandals. I always don't think about that. Oh yeah, they invaded North Africa.
Yeah, they run the length. They run the length of the boot, hop over to North Africa, and then they take over North Africa and settle there and exist until Belisarius conquers it under the Emperor Justinian.
How many years is the former Carthage a Vandal state?
Vandalia. I don't know. Look that up. Why don't you tell us?
I don't know if this is the most important thing that we could be looking into, but let's see. Not Vandalia, Ohio.
No.
Yeah, that's what comes up first.
Vandal, North Africa. Look at that. The Vandal Kingdom.
The Vandal Kingdom.
435 to
534.
Yeah, 435 to 534.
That is a pretty successful project.
100 years. Yeah.
It lasts longer than the USSR.
Damn. Yeah. Also, it's not just North Africa. It's also Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands.
Yeah, which is part of why all the racists say that Sicily is in Africa. That's part of the League of the North thing. So people who think the past goes away, it does not. But yeah, it's interesting to look at that, right? Because the people forget the bread transfer being so important because Europe, being the dangly bits off Asia, is shit food. Like, it really is. Like, there's not a lot of food growing land in Europe for any sizable population. That's across the board. I mean, like, that's why Vikinging happens in Norway, because there's not enough food. That's
why Operation Barbarossa happens.
Right. Like, there are some good growing lands in France and Germany, right, and in parts of Italy, but there's not enough if you have any sizable population at all. I mean, which is also why they always develop trade routes in Europe too.
Yeah, exactly. And that's in World War I, when Germany is defeated, a big part of that is because they're cut off from their food supply, which comes from outside of the country.
Which is why we invent nitrogen fertilizer in Europe. It's why it comes there first.
Yeah, and that is what drives Hitler's like obsessive idea that he needs to conquer the breadbasket of Europe and the Ukraine. It's all about food, right?
Yeah, everything always is.
Apparently, food is important.
Should we talk, since we brought up the Vandals, should we talk at all about this like brief discourse on the Germanic tribal culture as being quasi-egalitarian versus the Roman? Like, because that has something to do with the way that certain people have theorized the constant influx of Germanic tribal traditions into the Roman hinterlands as having some sort of major effect on the slow drift of the hinterlands of the provinces away from the core, or do we just need to say that's not really why?
Yeah, we should say that's not really why, because everything from Germanic people's racism, which is what we now call white racism, comes from that. This is why all the Southern Europeans weren't considered white, as they weren't from the free, Germanic, relatively egalitarian peoples.
And they were Catholic.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was a side note, though. We couldn't say that they were Catholic by the 18th century.
Well, that's why the Eastern Europeans weren't considered white either, even though they were
not Catholic.
No, the Eastern Europeans were Catholic. Like, I mean, we're not Eastern Europeans. I would say Central Europeans, like Hungarians, Czechoslovaks,
the bad
Poles.
Germans.
Yeah, the bad Germans, Southern Germans. Yeah.
But you can see like elements of, you can make a tortured claim, but not entirely illegitimate, like a claim between a line from the parts of Northern Europe that were never conquered by the Romans to the Reformation.
Yeah,
but,
you totally can.
But that's a little far afield from this discussion. Yeah,
it doesn't really stand up, though. I mean, as far as like that being what's driving that particular trend, because what we see, one, is that most of the German tribes that existed in the Roman Empire had internalized Roman social divisions. They had,
it's the other way around, right? It's the barbarian incursions into Rome, like Chris, like you said before, and I think we said last time as well, right? The Vandal state doesn't conquer Sicily and all in North Africa and then transform it. It's like they conquer it and then they run it the way the Romans did.
Yeah, that's true for the Visigothic kingdoms in Spain. Yeah. That's true for what would become the Holy Roman Empire while the Germans messed things up.
Germans.
Damn Germans.
Mm-hmm.